Our next speaker, David Abramson, Clinical Associate Professor of Social and Behavioral Sciences from NYU. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. Heard a lot about your subject, and you will talk about the role of NGOs as critical response agencies in a disaster. David, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Michal. Thank you, Yuval. Hello to everybody. Good morning to all of my colleagues to the west of the Atlantic, and good afternoon and evening to all of you who are to the east of the Atlantic. And I'll start by describing myself. I'm an older white male with more forehead than hair at this point. And I'm wearing the standard academic garb that is required, a blue button-down shirt with no tie. I'd also like to acknowledge just the incredible roster of people that you have assembled here. Listening to Janet speak about the Sendai Framework, the Paris Agreement, Article 11, but then particularly noting that organizations of persons with disabilities face barriers in being included in decision-making. That is directly related to what I want to speak about today. And I also wanted to add how much I've been inspired over the years by my colleague, Marcy Roth, who has been beating this drum consistently for so many years and from whom I have learned so much. So thank you for collecting all of us on this. So when we think about disasters, we often think about the failures of systems. And what is on the screen right now is a picture of people in a nursing home who are sitting waist deep in water after Hurricane Harvey in 2017. And I mean, this is a very striking, dramatic, and sad picture, in part because these are people who are sitting there as if they're, on any given Sunday instead of sitting waist deep in water. And so we look at this and we say, this is a failure of systems, a failure of governmental systems. Maybe it's some failure of, families in some ways, so that's hard to imagine what that would be. But it also points up to us how important it is to think about these things from a systems perspective and to think about what vulnerability really means. And so I'm offering one definition of vulnerability here, and this is one that has emerged over the years, in particular from the climate discussions, which is a combination of sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So sensitivity to a dangerous or toxic event would be a fixed characteristic, perhaps, such as age or maybe a weakened immune system. But it's this notion of the capacity to adapt to a stressor. And that really brings in so much about what we think about with functional limitation and disability, whether it's mobility or sensory limitations, or it's cognitive deficits, or people who are perhaps socially isolated, or who have scarce resources, living in poverty perhaps, and also thinking about those who wish to remain invisible to government authority. Over the years, some of the work that we've done has also looked at people in the United States who are undocumented and who want to remain outside of the reach of governmental entities. And for all of these people, the civil sector really represents a way to provide for them, to be a counterbalancing role for their vulnerability, to give them the means and resources to protect them from harm, to advocate, and to help communicate for them when they cannot. So there are roles that are played by these civil sector agencies, the non-governmental organizations, the CBOs, in both blue sky time, which is most of the time, and in dark sky time. And the things that these agencies do, as we all know, they're anchors in the lives of their clients. They are brokers, trusted brokers of essential information. They are who people will often turn to and listen to. And they're obviously providers of practical logistical support. And these are things that we would expect them to be doing on an everyday basis. The challenge is that a lot of times these agencies don't realize how critical a role they play when a disaster strikes. So we're not just speaking now about those organizations that are explicitly ready to stand up in a disaster, but those that do this on an everyday basis and don't even realize the extent to which they are critical first responders. When we think about climate hazard, it's easy to know or look around and see how much these events are increasing over the years. So on the slide right now, there's a bar graph that just shows the increasing number of natural disaster events globally that are occurring over time. And we know that these are happening. And their costs are considerable. In the United States alone, when we look at what we call the billion-dollar disasters, we're seeing more and more of them, sometimes many multiples within a given year. And with these disasters, often there comes both a bolus of money. There are governments that will immediately begin investing in a response and recovery infrastructure. But then there's the question of how prepared are those agencies, are the civil sector organizations to really ramp up? So when a disaster occurs, and what I'm displaying on the screen is one illustration. This is from Superstorm Sandy in 2013 through 2016. And it shows actually a very common pattern. It's a time trend that shows a slow ramp up of a human services sector that is trying to increase its capacity to address the problems around it. And it takes about a year, more or less, for that sector to have a sufficient capacity to really address the needs for the people in that area that they serve. Then there's a little bit of a plateau while those agencies have now embraced what they have to do. They've increased the services they offer in terms of eligibility, so they've gone wider in terms of their catchment. They've gone deeper in terms of the types of services they're offering. And then what usually happens is the funding ends. In the United States, it often begins to end at 18 months after a disaster, and there's a cliff. And you see that sharp cliff. So you get this ramp up that takes a year. It exists at the plateau where it's offering service. Then there's a cliff where all of a sudden the funding pretty much goes away. And the service system has to shrink, both in terms of who can be included and the nature of the services being offered. And this is not just unique to Sandy. This is what happens in every disaster. And the ways that the organizations are unprepared for this is they're unprepared for how they're going to have to adapt their own business model. Their workforce is generally not prepared for this. And we're not talking just about the response time frame. We're now talking about short-term recovery leading into long-term recovery. The workforce itself is going to have their own burdens and personal trauma. And the organizations are often not prepared in terms of their financial adaptability. So when we sort of put this all together in this systems kind of thinking, we start thinking about all of the different entities that really have to be engaged in this. We've got the government as being the primary driver of all this, often the primary funder, but more often than not, the government will fund others. Certainly in the United States, this is how this operates. They'll fund others to do the work. There'll be emergent groups that will stand up that had not existed previously. And of course, the business community will also be involved. And so when we think about what types of preparedness do we have to consider, especially for the civil sector, there are certain things that we immediately have to address. The first is the obvious one, which is a continuity of operations plan, a COOP, so that entities that ordinarily do not think of themselves as critical service providers have to change the way they're thinking about themselves. They are like EMS and first response entities because they need to be out there advocating on behalf of their clients, working with their clients, serving as that critical communication broker. Similarly, there's got to be a level of staff preparedness that is going to raise the capacity of the people that work for these kinds of civil sector agencies to understand that they are and should think of themselves as critical responders. And then there has to be a way of helping the clients to prepare as well, providing them with their personal emergency preparedness plans, but also to begin to think of how this is going to not just be dealt with as a response problem, but as a recovery problem. And the last slide and thing that I want to mention is that it's important to think about how do we move from vulnerability to resilience? And what are the kinds of things that these organizations can help a community, and including within that, people living with limitations and disabilities, what do these organizations have to be thinking about? Because it's more than simply the day-to-day activities of daily living. This is the place where organizations and this slice of society can really step in and make a difference. They need to be thinking about how can they increase the political capital of people living with functional limitations? How can they begin to leverage public resources and attention as needed? How can they begin to create a platform for social capital so that people with functional limitations and disabilities are no longer left on the outside, but are now a part of a lot of the social cohesion that is a part of a community's recovery? Certainly, how can you begin to engage economic capital and making sure that there are sufficient amounts of funds for reconstruction and recovery that will be particularly helpful for people that have limitations, and that allows for that as well. And then lastly, human capital. How can you make sure that people will have the capacity to live their best lives, to be physically and mentally healthy? And then with that, I will leave my email address up, and I'm happy to share anything we've learned over the years. And thank you again for this opportunity.